We begin talking about this period, and it's often known as Jacksonian America or the Age of Jackson because he was really a very dominant figure in American history. And you're going to find out today exactly why he is known for being that type of very domineering force. It all goes back to the election of 1824. You can see here on this electoral map that this election had four different candidates and that the electoral vote was split. There was no winner in the Electoral College. And when this happens, it goes to the House of Representatives. And eventually, John Quincy Adams was chosen over Andrew Jackson as President of the United States. Now, Andrew Jackson and his supporters are going to call this the corrupt bargain. Andrew Jackson did win the popular vote. Now, it wasn't a tremendous victory, but he still nonetheless won the popular vote. The other thing that fueled this whole accusation of a corrupt bargain was the fact that Henry Clay is going to help sway that vote in the House of Representatives. He's then later going to be appointed as John Quincy Adams' Secretary of State. And at this point of time, the position of Secretary of State was often seen as a stepping stone to the presidency. So they are going to call this a corrupt bargain, meaning that, Henry Clay had done a favor for John Quincy Adams in return for a government position. But basically, it's all because Jackson felt like he deserved this election. So Jackson and his supporters are going to begin completely throwing all of their efforts into disrupting John Quincy Adams' term in office. They form what now are going to be called the Democratic Party. Now, this is different from the Democratic Republicans. This is the Democrats, the Democratic Party, often called Jacksonian Democrats. This is all going to be different in the election of 1828. There was a lot more voter turnout because in the 1820s you begin to see voter requirements being lowered because before this you could not vote unless you were a property-owning white male. So what they do is they remove that property qualification. So at this point you did not have to own property to vote. And since Andrew Jackson appealed more to the quote common man, this is going to win him a lot more votes in this 1828 election. So you see here he easily won the 1828 election and is known as the first Western president. Now by Western we do mean Tennessee, not like California, because Western at this point was Tennessee. And Jackson is going to be easily reelected in 1832. So he is president in 1828 and 1832. In 1832 is the first time we see national nominating conventions used to nominate candidates for office. Now, Jackson's presidency, well, he is very well known as the common man's president because he did appeal to your quote common man. He is going to use something called the spoils system. This is where you're going to reward a loyal supporter a government position. You're going to give them government jobs. Now, this was seen as to the victor goes the spoils, that whole kind of idea there. But the problem with this is that oftentimes there would be people who are not qualified performing these positions. So this is going to be the whole reason that he's going to use this system, but it is going to kind of set it up for there to be some corruption on down the road. Now, while there is some more democracy, meaning that you've got more people who have a voice in their government, women and minorities were still ignored in this government. And we are not talking about the issue of slavery. We call it the Great Silence because really, after the Compromise of 1820, all the way up until the late 1840s, we're really not discussing the issue of slavery. So there was a great silence over the issue. A major controversy in his administration was the nullification crisis. High tariffs were a major issue, and if you remember, the South did not like high tariffs. They thought it was an undue burden on them. The Tariff of Abominations is the name that was given to the Tariff of 1828, and this is going to set up that state versus federal power. Again, you're going to be pitting those two against each other to see who had the more power to be able to get done what they wanted to. So that Tariff of 1828, the Tariff of Abominations, is going to lead to a head-to-head crisis over the state of South Carolina. Now, John C. Calhoun, who you see pictured here on the left, is going to once again present that theory of nullification. Now, at the time, he was Andrew Jackson's vice president, and he is actually going to write what's called South Carolina Exposition and Protest. In this document that he writes, it was anonymously written, but in this document he is going to propose that theory of nullification, stating that South Carolina would not be paying that tariff of abomination, that tariff of 1828. In fact, they even threatened to secede from the Union. That means to withdraw from the Union. They said, we will just no longer be a member of the United States. Andrew Jackson comes back, obviously being the President of the United States. He comes back and threatens to use force to require them to pay that tariff. He calls it the Force Bill, where he states that he will send troops to South Carolina to ensure that they pay that tariff. Now, it does not come to that, because Henry Clay is able to organize a compromise where they lowered that tariff over a 10-year period that helped make South Carolina happy, but also the federal government happy, and that they would be paying something. A major issue was our Indian policy. There were a lot of different views in the United States at this point in time, and it was all over the acquisition of Indian lands. Basically, we wanted to take land that Native Americans had held. So, in 1830, Andrew Jackson is going to pass what's called the Indian Removal Act. This is going to give money to the states to have Indians move to the west of the Mississippi River. So basically, we're going to start them a new Indian reservation. Again, this is very common that you see that as Americans expand westward, we begin to take more and more of Native American land, and that's exactly what you see here happening again, and we just want them moved. Well, the Cherokee Native Americans take this issue to the Supreme Court. They decide that if the government was going to be used to force them to move, that they would in turn use that same government to win their rights. The court case, Worcester versus Georgia, they were successful, and the court ruled that the state could not force the Cherokee removal. Well, remember, the job of the Supreme Court is to interpret a law and to hand down decisions. It is the job of the executive or the president to enforce those decisions. Andrew Jackson totally ignores the court and states that it was their ruling to let them carry it out. Andrew Jackson completely refused to carry out this ruling, so he ordered the Indian removal anyway. This is going to lead what's known as the Trail of Tears in 1838, where the Cherokee Indians were moved to west of the Mississippi River, leading to thousands of them dying along the way of cold and starvation and disease. So this is going to be that whole Indian policy of we want their land, we want to take it by almost any means necessary. The National Bank was another issue that Jackson dealt with. Andrew Jackson hated the Bank of the United States. He thought it was bad for the nation and that it only benefited the wealthy members of our country. He also believed that there was no constitutional basis for the National Bank to even exist. So, he makes it his personal mission to kill the National Bank. It didn't help the matters that he didn't like the man who was running the National Bank. His name was Nicholas Biddle. He kind of had a personal vendetta against him as well. So he is going to veto the charter of the National Bank, and he's going to withdraw all federal funds from that National Bank and put them in his favorite state banks, or called pet banks. Now, the problem with those pet banks are that they had very little regulation. So they were able to use all of that money however they wished, and it eventually leads to a monetary crisis. That was a big problem that Jackson creates. In fact, it was such a big problem that it doesn't really come out until after Jackson is no longer president and after Martin Van Buren, who had been Jackson's vice president, is going to be elected. So Martin Van Buren is going to be elected president in 1836, and he is the one that's going to suffer from those policies directly related to his vetoing of the National Bank. It was that panic of 1837. Now remember, a panic is a recession. So if you want to write down recession there, it's going to leave a lot of people in a lot of bad economic situations. And again, Jackson's not the one that gets blamed for it, even though he was basically the cause. So we see the development of what's called the Whig Party, if you want to highlight the Whig Party. So at this point we have the Democrats and we have the Whigs. So these are our two parties in the late 1830s. William Henry Harrison is going to be elected in 1840, and he becomes our very first Whig president. Remember, he was the Indian fighter who was going to defeat Tecumseh at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. He was elected with John Tyler, so this is William Henry Harrison on top, and this is John Tyler. He was elected, but only served about a month in office. He gave the longest inauguration speech, but served the shortest time in office because he came down with pneumonia after standing outside during his very long inauguration with no coat. He comes down with pneumonia. He dies 1 month into office, leaving John Tyler as president. So this is the first time we had a vice president come in and take over the office as president, which sets a precedent for another example that future presidents would follow that are going to be supported by constitutional amendments.